Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you are listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. I just returned to CMDA's national headquarters here in Bristol, Tennessee, after a week up north in Indianapolis, Indiana, for the 2022 CMDA National Convention. After 2 very long years of being separated due to the pandemic, what an incredible experience it was to be among so many giants of our faith as we gathered together again as the body of Christ in healthcare. I also had the opportunity to meet so many of you face to face and hear how you are bringing the hope and healing of Christ to our world today. One theme that continued to reverberate throughout my conversations and in our breakout sessions during the convention is this whole topic of gender and identity, and how that is sending shockwaves through healthcare as a whole, as our culture seems trapped within a highly charged narrative that is not at all based upon facts or evidence. For this week's interview, Dr. Jeff Barrows and I are joined by Dr. Miriam Grossman, a board-certified psychiatrist whose practice currently focuses on gender-confused young people as well as their parents. She is devoted to helping her patients and their families distinguish fact from fiction. Jeff and I were so impressed by her passion to help spread the word about gender ideology and its dangers. Our conversation today is a bit longer than normal because psychiatrists like Dr. Grossman are so rare. So let's jump right into the interview today. Well, today my guest on CMDA Matters is Dr. Miriam Grossman. She's a practicing physician, author, and public speaker. Before gender ideology was on anybody's radar, she was warning parents about its falsehoods and dangers in the final chapter of her 2009 book about sexuality education, which she entitled, "You're Teaching My Child What?" Dr. Grossman's practice currently focuses on gender-confused young people as well as their parents. In fact, I think her focus now is even more on the parents. She believes every child is born in the right body. She's been vocal about the capture of her profession by ideologues that has led to experimental treatments on children and the betrayal of their parents. She's authored 4 books, and she's been on more than 200 radio, news, and television shows. So as I told her earlier, this is definitely not her even 100th rodeo. Her work exposing the origin and hazards of the sexuality and gender industry has been translated into 11 languages. She's been to the British House of Lords, the United Nations. She graduated with honors from Bryn Mawr College and then from New York University Medical School. She completed an internship in PEDS at Beth Israel Hospital in New York City, and then a residency in psychiatry at North Shore University Hospital, Cornell University Medical College. And then finally, she did a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry. She's board certified in psychiatry and in the subspecialty of child and adolescent psychiatry, which makes her definitely an expert of great importance to us at CMDA on this whole transgender revolution. So welcome, Dr. Grossman, to our program.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
Well, Dr. Grossman, joining me today is a voice that our listeners are familiar with, Dr. Jeff Barrows, obstetrician gynecologist, who a little over 2 years ago took on the role of our senior vice president of bioethics and public policy. So welcome, Jeff, today.
Thank you, Mike. Great to be with you again, and I'm looking forward to this interview.
Well, Dr. Grossman, given your training and practice in child, adolescent, and teen psychiatry over many years, how have you seen your profession, your professional associations, and your colleagues in psychiatry changing their approach to mental health that's associated with gender and sexuality?
Well, I would say that there's been a sea change. I would say that there's been a revolution in the way that my profession looks at gender compared to when I was training. When I did my psychiatry residency and my fellowship in child psychiatry, I was taught that part of child development is that gender identity, whether a child identifies as being male or female, is pretty much fixed by the age of 3, around 3. So if you ask a child at around that age, are you a boy or a girl? We should be able to answer you, I'm a boy or I'm a girl. And then about a year later, that's followed by something called gender stability, which means that when I grow up, I'm going to be either a man or a woman. And then a few years later, at around age 7 or so, is a more sophisticated idea that's called gender permanence. And that means that a girl is not a boy, even if she, wears a suit and a tie and, boy shoes. A boy is not a girl, even if he wears a dress. So that's called gender permanence. And just to answer your question, when I was in training and for quite a few years afterwards, that was the understanding of what happens in child development. That was not questioned. And if there was a child who did not attain gender stability, gender permanence, and a child would express confusion about that or a wish or an insistence of being the other sex, then we considered that to be a psychiatric disorder called gender identity disorder. That was the diagnosis that was given to a child who persistently and consistently, over a long period of time, insisted that they either were the opposite sex or they were supposed to be the opposite sex. And this has all changed in a very dramatic way. And at this time, and this is going on, at least 20 years, but children are taught in their sexuality education and by their educators, at this point, doctors as well, the medical profession, the psychiatric profession. Kids and parents are told that gender is a spectrum, that gender is something separate from biology. So while we do have our biology, our chromosomes, our, different genitalia, that it's a completely separate thing that a person can experience themselves as being male or female, separate from what their chromosomes and their genitalia and their biology indicates. And that this is how we're made, and that it's not any sort of a disorder. And that with some people, they are going to require interventions for this, and that when a child or an adult or anybody becomes aware of the incongruence that they may have between their self-perception as male or female and their biology, that this is something that should be affirmed immediately and accepted, and like any other self-exploration thing, like we might discover that we are a wonderful a musician, an artist, or a Democrat, a Republican, or many, many different aspects of identity, and that it should be affirmed, and that kids should be told, by adults, that we accept this, we think it's wonderful that you're exploring this part of yourself, and that kids should be affirmed and given, basically, they should be running the show.
Yes, Dr. Grossman, I appreciate the recognition that all of these changes have happened relatively quickly in the psychiatry profession. And I think, as you've alluded to in several of your articles online, that the group that's hit this the hardest is the parents of these kids. And they don't know what to think of this. And I know that we've heard stories from our membership and others that when two parents take their child who is suffering from gender dysphoria into a lot of the professionals, maybe not even a gender transition clinic, but somebody who is supposed to give them some guidance, what they're often told is that because of the high risk of suicide in these kids, that they have to allow their child to transition. And it's even phrased in the way that, do you want a dead child or do you want a child of a different gender. And so my question for you is, could you briefly summarize the data regarding suicide in these children and its relationship to gender transition to help just encapsulate this for our members?
Sure. It's not difficult. We simply don't have evidence that transitioning a child, either socially or medically, impacts the elevated rate of suicide in transgender individuals. There is a slightly elevated risk of suicide in transgender individuals, but the best studies that we have coming out of the most GLBT-friendly countries, such as Sweden, Finland, and so on, are indicating that when we look at the long range, not just 6 months, not a year, not 2 years, but we look at the long range of how transgender people who are medicalized and transition, how they do, their suicide rate is not impacted by the fact that they transition.
Dr. Grossman, you mentioned Netherlands, Sweden, other countries where it seems like the runaway transgender train, as I've heard it referred to by some, seems to have been slowed down or even stopped because of some of these studies that you're referring to regarding suicide, that what we're told is making a difference for these kids. Affirmation is not making a difference. But here in the United States, it seems like not yet. This train is continuing to plow forward. So any signs, or how can we slow down this transgender train in the United States, since it seems like those who are in control of the messaging in our secular associations aren't slowing down a bit?
Well, you made such an important point that I was going to bring up, which is that Finland, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and France, and in addition, the psychiatrists in Australia and New Zealand, all these professionals from all these different countries, quote unquote progressive countries, are saying, just hold on a minute. This is going too far. The data are lacking. We are speeding ahead on transitioning these children, and that we lack the data that will indicate that what we're doing is really helpful. I'm not talking about, again, when someone goes on testosterone, they're going to feel really good for a little while because that just pumps you up and your mood is elevated and you feel great. But we're looking at the long term. We're looking at many years of data, and we simply don't have data on the current cohort of kids who declare their transgender identity as adolescents. Now, you are right in saying that other countries are slowing down and that they are putting up a red light, a cautionary light, or a stoplight in some conditions. And why are we not doing that here? That's an excellent question. And I would say that maybe our professional organizations are just so captured that it's difficult to turn that around. But I would also say that individual medical professionals are not speaking up. They are afraid to speak up. And we can't have that any longer. People have to begin speaking up, even if they perceive that there's some professional danger. When I spoke up at UCLA, I wrote a book called Unprotected, and it was originally anonymous, but that was for just a few days. My name came out after just a few days after it was published. And did I suffer from that? Yeah, there were definitely repercussions. And I had to leave UCLA, and my life there was made quite miserable. And there were jobs that I could not get after writing, after speaking out. But I mean, listen, I don't know. Look, I can only speak for myself. I have to be able to sleep at night. And when I see what's going on, I mean, these kids, they're being sterilized.
Mm-hmm. Well, Miriam, you did an interview in December that indicated you are now devoting your time and energies to the full-time care and support of the parents of trans teens. who deny their biological sex. So I know that our audience, which is made up mostly of healthcare professionals, would be very interested in the advice that you would give them as they encounter parents in similar situations with a child or a teen who is going down this path, questioning their gender and maybe even being supported in it by their school counselors. What advice would you give them?
I would say that you should know that these parents don't trust you and they don't want to come see you because they're worried that when they arrive, their child will be asked what their pronouns are, their child will be asked what their gender identity is. It won't be challenged whatsoever. If their daughter's wearing a binder to compress their chest, their breasts, the parents are concerned that the pediatrician won't have any issue with that, won't point out the dangers of that. Yeah, the parents don't trust the medical providers.
When you get together with other child psychiatrists, I actually understand from some reading yesterday, there's a little over 8,000 of you in the country. I'm guessing that it's going to be tough for parents to find help, someone like you across the country. They've got you in your community, but are going to find very few mental health professionals who are willing to listen to them and support them. What resources do they have these days?
Well, you're right. It is difficult. It's not completely impossible. And there are some new organizations, the new ones cropping up all the time, specifically to help parents. I'm going to tell you the names of those organizations, but I don't want to forget something important. And that is there's an overlap between the COVID lockdowns and the whole transgender epidemic. Many kids in this country were in lockdown and away from school for 2 years or some large part of 2 years. And during that time of isolation, they were online and they were anxious and they were depressed. A lot of these vulnerable children were discovering online communities, online trans communities, or communities that are, encouraging kids to question their gender identity and their sexuality. And they found a community. They lost their regular community at school and in their neighborhoods and so on, but they found these virtual communities. And some of these communities are very dangerous. They have adults and older teenagers that are grooming the younger kids. And so a lot of the families that are coming to me now provide the same exact story, that their kid was in lockdown and they discovered these communities online and have been completely just influenced by their new relationships and friendships online. And there's a lot of pornography that's being shared and a lot of bad stuff that's going on. So you asked about organizations that can be helpful to the parents. So first of all, I'll give you the name of an amazing organization that's not only for parents, but for all of your listeners who are in the field of medicine. And that is the Society of Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, SEGM.org. SEGM.org. Fabulous organization. They're going to have all the studies, all the newest information. A few days ago, like last week, I think it was, France came out with a statement about their country is now going to be, they're calling attention to the fact that we don't have data and that we have to exercise much more caution with kids. So SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, within hours, they had a translation from the French of that important statement. For the parents, I would say the American College of Pediatrics, which is acpeds.org, acpeds.org, and that's also good for your medical providers. Advocatesprotectingchildren.org. It's all spelled out. Advocatesprotectingchildren.org. Fantastic organization that helps parents. Tons of resources, videos, all kinds of information. And then I also want to bring your listeners' attention to a website called gendermapper.com, Gendermapper. and they are mapping all the new gender clinics that are popping up almost, another one every week. We used to have 1 or 2 child gender clinics in this country 10, 15 years ago. And now I think we have 70. It's a big business.
Well, Miriam, I have a circle around back to a practical question as well. You alluded to the fact that you've suffered from some discrimination because of the books you've written and professionally had to make some changes. And I know that many of our members have been silent on this issue up to this point, but is there room for them to still get engaged if they feel themselves waking up to this issue and recognizing it's not going to go away, it's only going to get bigger, it's getting more and more pushed by government agencies? Is there room for them to get engaged? And how would you advise a family physician who also does a fair amount of mental health care or a mental health professional to really take some distinct steps to become engaged like you are in this issue?
What is it that Nike says? Just do it. Just do it. Refuse to go along with the lie. Refuse to ask about pronouns, names. If that is an issue for a specific child, that can certainly be discussed. But to automatically go along with the agenda that's being pushed at us, this policy that everyone in your office should, under their name tag, have their pronouns, and on the forms have all the pronouns question and the preferred name. All those issues are signals to the parents and to the child that you're buying into this. So, that's just a beginning, but you have to get educated, start reading, start understanding what this is all about. And certainly don't think that this is not going to affect your family, because it's going to affect every family. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that every family is going to have a transgender child. That's not what I'm saying. But this is a social movement. This is a movement to change society, change our civilization, and to deny the importance of biology, to deny the nature of male and female. And everyone is hearing about the impact of this, what it's on female sports, on female spaces. So when I say it's going to impact everyone, I mean, if you take your girl into a restroom somewhere, there can be a man there. If we don't push against this, then it's going to affect all of us. And the impact of having a biological man in a woman's restroom, well, there is a safety aspect to it, but even more so, more than the safety aspect, is the confusion that presents to the child. So what really is a man? What is a woman? What is a boy? What is a girl? Is there some concrete, objective truth behind that language, male, female, boy, girl, man, woman? Or is it just a question of how you feel? That's going to impact all of society, and it won't impact us in a good way. I'd like, if it's okay, to just review some of the basic terms for your listeners so that we all know what we're talking about. The language can get confusing sometimes for people. And so I just want to go through some basic terms. So sex is a biological term, and it refers to how a species reproduces. So humans have 2 different sex cells or gametes, sperm and eggs. So sex is binary. And that's an important thing to remember, because as we go down this kind of rabbit hole of gender ideology, the word sex is being redefined, and it's very confusing. But sex is a biological term. It is not something that is assigned at birth. All of your listeners who, went to medical school or dental school or, took biology in college and even in middle school recall that male or female is determined at conception, at the moment that the sperm meets the egg and becomes one unified cell. That cell already at the moment of conception is either male or female. So the phrase assigned at birth, sex assigned at birth or gender assigned at birth really is not accurate at all. It's not true. So that's what sex is. Gender is much harder to define. Gender is a perception of oneself, a feeling, an identity of being either male or female or neither male or female. But there's many iterations of gender at this point. I lost count of how many there are. But gender is not something that can be measured or seen or tested for. It boils down to a person's own experience. So a person can identify as male or female. They can identify as neither male or female, so that would be non-binary. And the term transgender is applied to a person whose gender, their perception of themselves, their experience of themselves is not aligned, so to speak, or not the same as their biology. So that's what transgender means. Then we have the term transition. Transition has different stages, different parts. First is social transition. And following social transition, usually almost 100% of the time, is medical transition. And we can get into that more, but just as an overview, the social transition means that people will pick a different name, different pronouns, might start to dress differently, have a different haircut, basically, a different presentation within their day-to-day lives. That's the social transition. And medical transition starts with puberty blockers and then goes on to cross-sex hormones and sometimes surgery. So I just wanted to go through that. I hope you don't mind. I think it's important for people to have like a glossary of these various terms that we're going to be using.
Dr. Grossman, when we first got on this conversation together a few minutes ago, we were talking about how Dr. Barrows and I and CMDA, we have been in search of child psychiatrists willing to speak up like yourself. And what we have learned, actually in January, we interviewed a couple, a mom and dad of an autistic boy who was having gender identity confusion, and we talked with them through their travails. I'm sure that you attract a number of these parents, maybe from all over the country, because of your books and your articles, and you're doing active patient care, counseling, psychiatry care. What has been your experience with these parents who've brought adolescents or teens to you? The teen truly is struggling with gender dysphoria. This isn't a case of rapid onset gender dysphoria, but truly having gender dysphoria. Does your experience align with what we keep hearing, the number of 85% desistance in these kids if there is supportive therapy along this path?
Okay, I just need to correct you there, because when you say real transgender, almost all the cases that we see now are the ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria. So, I mean, when you say real, do you mean like children from the age, very, very young age?
Yes, I'm referring to what in one of your articles you say when you did your training, you wondered if in your whole career you might see one of them, a child with true dysphoria. The incidents I've seen in Australia and some of these other countries 30, 40 years ago, just incredibly rare.
Yeah, very rare. I have never seen a patient like that.
Wow. So all the cases are more along what Lisa Littman wrote about from Brown, this rapid onset gender dysphoria, peer contagion, if you will. And so I would think that in that case, I know I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm far from it, I'm a general surgeon, but I would think in that case, Miriam, that some attentive counseling and assurance would have pretty good outcomes in that situation.
I'm sorry to laugh. I'm so sorry. No, 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 no. You don't understand. The therapy is very, very difficult. The more indoctrinated the child is, the more difficult it is. I have 45 minutes, 50 minutes with a child once a week, and then they go out 24/7 into a culture, back to a school, a friend circle, a media saturated culture that is affirming them and telling them that anyone that challenges your gender identity is the enemy. It is a very, very difficult thing. And you asked about the parents. The parents are going through hell. The parents are going through hell because they are terrified that their physically completely healthy child is going in the direction of dangerous hormones and dangerous surgeries. And they're terrified that they're going to lose their child, that the child is going to move along in that direction because they're getting so much support from school, from their doctors, from almost everywhere. So it's a hell of a situation for parents.
With that in mind, and I appreciate your candor there in terms of my misunderstanding, no question about it. But I would think then, just as Kira Bell in the UK, I would think that in that situation, there would even be a higher risk, a legal risk down the road that such an individual, after going through, you referred to it in some of your articles, is there not then down the road going to be a tidal wave, you will, of those who are suing care professionals who took them down the gender affirmation trail?
Well, that is beginning. There is right now an investigation by a law firm that opened up recently for people who have been harmed by puberty blockers. So that is starting. You know, I hope it's going to happen, but do you mind? I would like to ask you as a surgeon, what's going on with your peers, the surgeons that are doing these, bilateral mastectomies on girls as young as 13?
Good question. Really good question. And I've spoken out on the program before. The very first article I ever saw in our Blue Journal, the Journal of the American College of Surgeons, was not about outcomes. It was not about complications, morbidity, mortality. It was not on indications. The first article in our main journal was about the financial situation involved with setting up a gender clinic and how that an academic university, that a department that sets up a gender identity clinic will actually do okay, in fact, might even do well financially. That is the article. That was the Sentinel article in the Blue Journal for surgeons. So one of the reasons that I have, I guess, gotten so passionate on this issue is because this is an issue going across specialties. This is not quite like abortion where OBGYNs and maybe primary care, but so many specialties are being touched, including my own. And even the change in terminology, Dr. Grossman, of instead of, as you referred to, double mastectomy in one of your articles, bilateral mastectomy, not using those terms because they're offensive terms, but chest masculinization. I think that the majority of surgeons are appalled by what's happening, but there will always be those. I've been interviewed on radio programs, Dr. Grossman, in which they say, aren't you concerned that if you don't participate in this legal procedure that someone won't get the care that they need? And my response is, are you kidding me? Just pick New York City. There's probably 100 plastic surgeons that would line up to do this procedure if I won't do the procedure for this young girl.
So that's fascinating that the very first article in the Blue Journal was about finances. And, in Oregon, kids don't need their parents' consent to get hormones and surgery. I think at 16, is it? I'm not sure. But Oregon is one of the most scary. It's a very scary situation in Oregon. So, yeah, we have a big problem, folks. We have a big problem.
I was just going to point out and observe that at the root of this, we've alluded to it, is the compliance of the professional organizations that should be policing the science and policing the members so that the members are doing good for their patients within that particular specialty. And we now are in an age when exactly the opposite has happened. They have bought into an ideology against the science, ignored the science, and are pushing this. And as you said, Dr. Grossman, it's scary. But I do think that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, there's going to be huge regret. Until then, we have to do our best to fight it in our specialties. And we're one of the few organizations that's a medical organization that's standing up against it. You mentioned American College of Pediatricians. That's a good one as well. We work closely with them on several different issues. So we're very happy to have all the partners we can in this fight.
And Jeff, I might add, just for our listeners' benefit, we've mentioned this before, but we have a whole set of bioethics position statements at CMDA. And for our listeners, you can go to cmda.org/ethics and find those, including an excellent, recently updated one on transgender identification. Very long bibliography. There are biblical, biological, social issues, medical, ethical, and then our recommendations to the Christian community, our recommendations for Christian healthcare professionals, our recommendations regarding non-discrimination. We're often, by our opponents accused of discriminating, and we will, Dr. Barrows and myself will say, we're willing to offer all kinds of treatments to anyone who comes through our door, but we're not willing to offer gender-affirming treatments as they're described, or abortion. So there are treatments, procedures we're not willing to do, but we will take care of all comers, whether they are transgender identifying or not. That's where we stand at CMDA.
I would like to say one thing, because I didn't have a chance to touch upon the topic of regret and detransitioners.
Sure, go ahead.
It's very important to realize that the number of young people who are regretting their medical transition is at this point, I would say, exploding. The average number of years after transition is about 8 years. So it takes time for people to kind of realize. One, I was listening to it on YouTube for one transgender individual, and he put it so well. He said, with every step, it was like a present. Like first, he got started using a girl's name and girl's pronouns, and that felt good, and wearing girls' clothing and a girl's haircut. And then, he got on estrogen, and that was like amazing. And then he started to pass as a girl, and every step was like, it's good, but it's not enough. Like, I feel good, I feel better, but I don't feel 100% a woman. And then, they all the way down with estrogen and growing breasts, and, this is good, but it's still not enough. And then finally having surgery and being castrated and having his penis removed. And you know what? That wasn't enough either. And then the way that he put it was, I realized there are no more Christmas presents to open. I opened all of them. And that's when the deep regret sets in. And so these people are speaking up loud and clear right now. If you go, there's a Reddit subgroup for detransitioners, and there's 26,000 members of that Reddit subgroup. So there's just hordes and hordes of people that are speaking up. And their main message is, why did you let me do this? Why did my doctors let me do this? Why didn't they look into my comorbidities, my anxiety, my depression, my autism? Why did they give me hormones so easily? Why did they perform operations on me so easily? That's what they're saying, the detransitioners. And just your question about lawsuits, you have to understand that for these people to stand up and to acknowledge what they did and how they feel about it now is really, really hard.
Well, Dr. Grossman, thank you for joining us today. I think that Dr. Barrows would agree with me. You are a rare voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Dr. Grossman, I just wish you the best as you continue this very important work, and I hope that many others will join you in it, because it sounds like it's almost a little overwhelming and the need is so great. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me.
What a sobering discussion with Dr. Grossman, especially hearing firsthand about how this transgender culture in America is having such a dangerous impact on our children. It was especially poignant to me when she shared about the detransitioner who said that he had done everything possible in terms of medicines and surgery, and yet the treatments just weren't enough. It never gave him the answers he was looking for, and that is so true. When we are searching for a resting place for our identity that is outside of Christ, we will always be left searching and wanting more. But when we place our identity in Christ, who completes us, that's where we can find true fulfillment and joy in our lives. Will you join me this week in praying specifically for the patients and parents who are struggling with gender and identity? Well, during our interview with Dr. Grossman, she specifically shared a handful of resources for you, and we've included those resources in the show notes today. I encourage you to check them out. Yes, first for your own benefit, but also so that you can refer others to these sites as well as these organizations. You also heard me briefly mention the conversation I had back in January with Diane and Mark, the parents of a teen who's struggling himself with gender dysphoria. If you haven't listened to that episode, be sure to look for it in the CMDA app or online at cmda.org/CMDA Matters. One of the key points they shared in that interview was how they felt abandoned by their healthcare professionals, even those they've known for many years. CMDA members, you are perfectly poised to stand in this gap and offer resources from a medical, scientific, psychological, and biblical perspective for patients and their families who are struggling with the gender and identity crisis. The integral step is equipping and arming yourself to have these important discussions with your patients. We have several options for you to start delving into these topics and learning more. First, I want to point out you can visit CMDA's website at cmda.org/ethics and find our CMDA's ethics statements. These statements are designed to provide you with biblical, ethical, social, and scientific understanding of a variety of bioethical issues. I believe that we have 90 of these statements available to you, as well as the Christian community. On that webpage, you'll find a drop-down executive summary of the CMDA position, and then, if you choose, you can download the full PDF on that particular ethical position. CMDA's Ethics Committee spends countless hours researching and crafting these statements because we place so much value on providing these as resources for our members as well as the general Christian community. Included in the long list of statements are statements specifically addressing transgender identification, homosexuality, conscience rights, and many more. Again, you can find these statements. Just go to cmda.org/ethics. We've also started offering continuing education credits with several of these statements. As you heard me share with Dr. Grossman, you could earn credits in the CMDA Learning Center just by reviewing CMDA's ethics statement on transgender identification. To learn more, visit the CMDA Learning Center today at cmda.org/learning. We also have a few books in the CMDA bookstore that I believe will prove helpful to you. First, the book, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Debate. Drawing on the best insights from biology, psychology, and philosophy, author Ryan T. Anderson offers a balanced approach to the policy issues, a nuanced vision of human embodiment, and a sober as well as honest survey of the human costs of getting human nature wrong. He reveals a grim contrast between the media's sunny depiction and the often sad realities of gender identity struggles. He introduces us as readers to people who tried to transition but found themselves no better off in the end. Especially troubling is the suffering felt by adults who were encouraged to transition as children, but later came to regret it. And there's a reason that many do regret it. As Anderson shows, the most helpful therapies focus not on achieving the impossible, which is changing bodies to conform to thoughts and feelings, but on helping people accept and even embrace the truth about their bodies and about reality. This discussion will be of particular interest to parents who fear how an ideological school counselor might just try to steer their child in the wrong direction. The second book is entitled God and the Transgender Debate by Andrew T. Walker. This book helps Christians understand what the Bible actually says about gender identity. It will help us to engage lovingly, thoughtfully, and faithfully with one of the most explosive cultural discussions of our day. It also includes a section looking at practical questions, including, can someone be transgender and a Christian? Should I mind if people who are biologically the other sex are in my restroom? What should church leaders do if a congregation member asks for their child to be identified as the opposite gender? If you want to learn more and love better and are open to considering what God has to say about sex as well as gender, this hope-filled book is for you. You can find both of these books and many others in the CMDA bookstore just by going to cmda.org/bookstore. In addition, CMDA's psychiatry section is poised to speak into this topic of gender and identity. One of their main goals is to promote within the church the knowledge and understanding of valid psychiatric approaches to mental health and healing consistent with Christ's redemptive love. If you're interested in getting involved, just visit cmda.org/psychiatry. This focus on gender as well as identity continues to be the most pressing hot topic among our members. So we are working with the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary to host an in-person conference that we're calling Critical Conversations on Identity and Gender. Our cultural norms in America have rapidly changed, as has our ability to meaningfully dialogue about those shifts. And nowhere is this truer than in discussions about gender and sexuality. Medical as well as pastoral care face a daunting task in the midst of discussions about transgenderism and choices about sexual preference, especially when theological reflections on how we are made are deliberately left out. As Christians, how do we speak effectively, truthfully, and graciously while giving care in such an environment? Be sure to save the date for this critical conversation as we consider the theology, science, legal counsel, and pastoral care required to serve people well, whether as individual caregivers or as fellow members of our society. You can join us live in Dallas, Texas, or virtually on August 5th and 6th for this important conversation. Registration opens very soon, so save those dates, August 5th and 6th, right now. Speaking of Dallas Theological Seminary, registration is now open for our next webinar with the Hendricks Center at DTS. Would you join us on Thursday, May 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for Engaging in Challenging Times with Dr. Darrell Bach and Dr. David Bolender as we explore how Christians in today's very challenging culture, especially in healthcare, can effectively engage and be God's light in a dark world. Dr. Bach examines 6 key passages of Scripture on engagement in the context of our current culture wars here in America. He will challenge us to consider how the church might just be misdirected in many of our engagement approaches based upon these Scriptures. Dr. Bolender will moderate and lead us through a time of Q&A, and we'll even discuss specific healthcare-related scenarios to think through together in that webinar. We invite you to bring your questions to the discussion as we reflect on some of the harder realities we face as we live in this pluralistic world. If you'd like more information and to register, just visit cmda.org/DTS webinar. Next week's CMDA Matters episode features my conversation with Dr. Harold Koenig, who is the associate editor of the Journal of Religion and Health. As a long-time, many decades professor at Duke University, he is one of the foremost voices in the research on the interrelatedness of spirituality and health. As always, if you want to suggest a future guest for me to interview on the podcast, you can just email us at cmdamatters@cmda.org. And if you like our podcast, like many others have, would you be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share us on your favorite social media platform? As I close today's episode, just wanted to share this comment we recently received from a medical student who said, "I thank God that there are still godly, spirit-filled people in the world, especially within the medical field, who are willing to take a stand for biblical principles and for the lives that God has created. Please know that I'm praying for you all, and please share this with anyone who needs encouragement to continue advancing the Lord's kingdom and bringing glory to Him." As we close today's episode, that is the encouragement I wanted to pass along to you, CMDA. I pray you have the courage to stand for biblical principles and for the lives that God has created. I also pray that Christ's love would empower you to communicate patience and love and truth to your patients and their parents. And I pray that God will do a mighty work in the minds and hearts and souls of your patients who are going through these gender identity struggles. And as you help them, you will be equipped to bring the hope and healing of Christ to the world. That's what matters to CMDA, and CMDA matters. We'll see you next week, God willing.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.